Well, Jim is the author of 9 books with a strong focus on maturing our relational skills for leaders. So he's co-authored the book Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You, which has sold over 100,000 copies in 11 languages. And Jim has published numerous articles, developed 4 sets of videos, relational leader training called Thrive, which is fantastic. So people should check that out as well. I love that. I love that series. So he's also worked with has a nonprofit, the intersection of brain science and theology called The Life Model Works. And it is building contagiously healthy Christian communities through equipping existing networks with the skills to thrive. So Dr. Wilder has extensive clinical counseling experience, and he has served as a guest lecturer at Fuller Seminary, Biola, Talbot, Paloma, Montreat, Tyndale, and so many other places. So Jim, it's such a pleasure to have you today. And I'm so looking forward. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. So thanks for being here.
Oh, it's great to be with you and finally discuss the brain with somebody else who likes to think of it in spiritual terms. So we should have fun.
We should. I know we will. I know fun is always the goal.
For sure. If you can't make it fun, then what's the point?
What is the point? I agree. Well, let's talk about attachment for a second. So would you maybe for our audience describe the different types of secure and insecure attachment, just to give us a quick grid and orienting us into what attachment is?
Yeah, well, the basic point of attachment is, do we have somebody who will share our experiences with us? And so the insecure attachments are ones that feel like, well, if this emotion gets very strong or unpleasant, you're going to dump me, you're going to move away. Or on the other end, you don't find me interesting at all. So there's nothing about me that you want to attach with. Or if I try to get attached to you, get close to you to share an experience, you freak me out. So, those are the insecure kinds. And secure means that, I like you well enough that I'm going to share whatever it is that's going on in your life, and we'll work it out together. So, pretty straightforward, mostly nonverbal, though. It comes back basically to the look on your face when, you see me or my reactions. So it operates very quickly.
And below the level of consciousness for the most part, right? We're not even like things are happening inside, and then suddenly we're uncomfortable, but we may not necessarily know why.
Yeah, I often think of it not as below the level of consciousness so much as faster than consciousness, because it happens before we get conscious about it. Conscious takes about 1/5 of a second, and all this stuff has already happened. So, and we're not used to paying attention to ourselves, we'll miss it.
So I think a lot of people, as they become aware of attachment and what that means for them and what that looks like, usually think about it in terms of relationship with their parents, right? Because it's formed as we're children in relationship to the caregivers, because not everybody has parents, but most people don't think about it in terms of their relationship with God. So I'm wondering if you can maybe help us understand how this dynamic of how we feel other people feel about us and how much we trust them and attach to them, how is that related to our relationship with God?
Well, a lot of it has to do with identity. First of all, when the brain of a baby who's just been born, if you look at that, a lot of the parts haven't even grown yet. So the brain is, among other things, a sort of self-organizing kind of organism. So it's looking for something to model, to copy, and figure out how do you make this thing work. So the first attachment to our caregivers, to our parents, is, let me kind of follow a mind that's bigger than mine, and you show me how this is done. How do you, what does it mean when you have a look on your face? What does it mean when you're getting close to me? How am I supposed to respond? So it's duplication in many ways of the minds that you see early on. So the most people think of that as the only part of attachment. It's, the creating a working identity, which is primarily around how we handle the way we feel. Because babies, don't have a very big working vocabulary. So not until they're about a year and a half, they even start using words. So we've kind of figured out who we are by that point and how much we're worth. So this is the first part of attachment. Second part of attachment is to learn how other people think about us and how do they see us, not just who am I, but, how do people think about me when they see me? And obviously, if you never figure out who I am, I can't figure out that other people are somebody either. So people who have difficulty with identity have real hard time with God's identity. What kind of being is this? I can't even see him. And then if you, in the second phase of life, kind of probably more from age 4 on till maybe 12, how do people see me and how do I interact with them? If everyone's mad at me all the time or don't think I'm very important, then, when we think about God, this mind that we can't see, he's either mad at us all the time or doesn't think we're very important. It sort of casts a shadow on how other minds work. And then when we get to age 12, 13, something like that, we have the second big apoptotic period in the brain where it reorganizes itself. And from that point on, we're looking to become part of a group identity. And that's the part of attachment almost no one thinks about. But now we're part of a group who, and if we think about God's people, what kind of people are we going to be from now on? We learn this from other groups. That's actually those sources for our ongoing growing conscience. So if all of those things are working well, then we have a way of interacting with God that makes sense. And if those parts are chaotic, then trying to figure out the God we can't see stays chaotic in our brain too. Like, I don't know how to make sense of this being, which on the best of days is hard for human beings to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we get to that kind of group identity and value formation just naturally through biological growth, but it goes through all these places right before that are foundational in the wiring, right? So the foundational wiring of the early infant, toddler years, and I think about people who have insecure environments, right? They're either ignored, neglected, abused. They can't depend on their caregiver for food and shelter and warmth and comfort and all of those things. And just how much that is wired into the foundational paradigm of how safe the world is, how secure they are, their ability to know themselves, and then projecting that and thinking about God in the same way, right? Because if that's the way that you encounter the world, why would God be any different than every other experience that you've had? So
yeah, John goes so far as to say in his book, the book that First John, his epistle, not his gospel, but he said if you can't love, and that's really the Greek word for attachment, if you can't be attached to people you do see, how can you claim to be attached to God who you can't see? So it's sort of his presumption, and he's actually the disciple of attachment, the one who was most attached to Jesus. And he's basically saying, if we can't make the system work with people, you're not going to make it work with God. It won't be true there. And so that's where it starts getting interesting, that overlay between the two of them. Because what do you do when people have proven to be completely unreliable?
right, which they inevitably do because they inevitably are, right? So
Mm-hmm.
do you think that we can be more attached to people because we can see them than we are to God? Or do you think the way that we relate to people is an expression of the way that we think about God? I mean, like, is that a chicken and egg conversation, or what do you
Oh yeah,
think there?
definitely is a chicken and egg conversation. I've tried for 30 years to predict, because I've sort of partnered with God as I see it to help people develop better attachments. And I have so far been completely unable to predict whether God is going to improve the attachment directly from his end so that people attach better with other human beings, or is he going to help have people actually attach better to other human beings so that they understand him more. And which one he's going to do, I have found absolutely no way to predict. But that he does both, I find 100% predictable. And he moves back and forth. And it's like, okay, we've done something here. Now practice it with people. Or, learn something with people. Now come practice it with me. And so I see it's a very permeable, whichever one you need is the one that God's going to pick. So not the difference between chicken and egg, you're saying which one actually starts the process. And with God, that's, he could start at either end, and he'll work at both sides of it.
So maybe more like a seesaw, like he's just
I think
always
so. Yeah.
making ground, helping us.
That's best I could observe.
Oh, I love that. It gives us all hope, because the answer is then just yes, right?
Yes.
All the ways.
Right.
All the ways.
Yeah. Practice it with people and ask God about it is the two sides of it.
I love that. So if we're thinking about being disciple makers in let me step back for a second. Like 50% of people sociologically and developmentally don't get out of the groupthink space, right? The biologically mature that far, and then they're there, and it's okay.
It's a comfort zone. That's where you hang out.
Yeah. And so the group identity of who we teach each other that God is, and who we teach each other that we are, and how God thinks about us. And then that's kind of like the seed bed for disciple making, right? So we start to become aware of how we're discipling each other and how we're being discipled, because the groupthink matters now. And I'm just wondering, what kind of things can we have in that environment? How can we think about attachment as disciple makers, understanding that how we think about God is the first influence of how other people will think about God and how we connect to them. So how can we use that for our good?
Well, here's where I would just already sort of challenge your wording a little bit, because thinking about God is not nearly so important in my mind because of what most people think of thinking as conscious thoughts. Loving God or caring about God or sharing life with God, which many of us don't consider thinking, although from a brain perspective, it clearly is thinking. It's just thinking faster than conscious thought. What we're actually trying to change is, how do we care about others in a way that communicates to them how God cares about them? As I read the passages about discipleship, they seem to be commands to say, you make a disciple of your own. Most people think of it as make a disciple of Jesus for Jesus, and you kind of omit yourself from that. But the passages seem to say, if it's Jess should have Jess's disciples, and she should be teaching them everything that Jesus taught her. As opposed to Jess is going to have to make disciples for Jesus. I'm going to try to keep myself out of this loop. I'll just teach him everything he said, but I won't be that example for them of how Jesus lived. And I think the brain is waiting for an example of someone who's going to care about me. Now, the problem here is really the Second Great Awakening came along in the church, and all we decided that salvation is just making a decision, and discipleship is making a second decision that we're just going to be obedient. So we just have to give you the rules now, and now you line up and do it. But if discipleship is attachment. All attachments are permanent. So once I form an attachment to you, the brain has no delete function for attachments. It's a permanent, non-replaceable relationship. So an attachment with you can't be replaced by an attachment to somebody else. I can add an attachment to somebody else, but the way I explain it is, I've met a lot of people in the world, a lot of women, and if someone was to tell me that any of these wonderful people was my mother, my brain would go, no, it isn't. My mother is my mother, and you may be a wonderful person, you may even be a good mother, but you're not my mother. And maybe I'll add a second mother, but you'll be mother number two, not mother number one. They're not replaceable, they're not interchangeable. A dentist is interchangeable. Like, okay, well, dentist so and so's gone, the new dentist is in, he'll do his job. We try to do church that way. The pastor's interchangeable. We just swap him out or her out for another good speaker or whatever it is that we happen to think makes a pastor. But a discipleship, if it means I'm making a lifelong attachment to you, means that I'm committed to sharing life with you and showing you how God does it. And who, by the way, God is committed to sharing life with us. I sometimes think it's not a great idea on his part, but
So, I mean, I love that. I love the way that we're talking about this, because like even Martin Buber talked about how that in the I thou relationship, the only way we know ourself is in the dynamic of the relationship with the other, which is why God's an entity with a consciousness or personality or whatever. That gets nebulous, but not an energy, right? Like not an unknowable abstract energy, but an
right.
actual entity who can care about us back.
Mm-hmm.
So that we can know ourselves. And the brain is actually created, right, to work that way. The only way that we know ourselves is in relationship with other people. They and it's how we know ourselves then is how we know them, right? It's the cyclical, reciprocal kind of dynamic. So if loving God and loving people become, instead of thinking about, right, like you said, I thank you for this. Just demonstrates how long I've been in the religion world and disconnected from the neuroscience world, because it's those things are very accurate and specific.
Yeah. Well, Saint Clare, 1,000 years back, was one of the first Christian writers. Was the word she kept using was mirrors, and so and which is really even been picked up by neuroscience with the mirror neurons. But the brain's really not designed to spend a whole lot of time observing itself. And one of the things we can't observe are the things which aren't formed in us yet. So the brain is always looking for a greater mind, someone who knows more, can show us something we don't know yet about ourselves and others. And this is this mirroring process. And in that way, we also mirror to each other, because we've got, a couple of observers inside, at least. One is, observing our interaction, but another is saying, how does someone else see us? And that's the one where group identity comes in. And so we become mirrors for how God sees you. And that it gets pretty complicated because it goes very fast and runs lots of different directions. But on the other hand, rather simple. If my response to you is a bad one, and I'm the one who's been teaching you about God, and I say, well, if you're going to be that kind of person, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, then that becomes a pretty good indicator in my brain, at least, that maybe God is going to do the same thing, which is why we also want to have our own interaction with God. But our brain has to learn how to recognize God thoughts as separate from all other kinds of thoughts that are running around. And so, again, it's a learning process, which we do by listening to what other people say. Was that a God thought? Huh. Well, I had this thought. What do you think of this one? So again, we're exchanging with each other, comparing notes. It's meant to be done in community, as we would call it.
Right. Which is why, and I love what you're saying about how attachments aren't replaceable. So when we do attach to somebody, and I think about the youth group, or the, that teenager, that middle schooler who attaches to their youth leader, and youth leaders have like the shortest cycle of anybody in ministry. I think it's now
Right
down
up
to
there
six
with worship leaders.
months. Yeah. So it used to be a year or two. I think it's down to 6 months, not
Oh
even
boy.
making it through an academic year. Like, then they never form an attachment to learn how God sees them from this person that's supposed to do that. And then even pastors, we talk sometimes in pastoral circles or ministry leadership circles, we talk about the pain of those relationships, and how that pain is a sign that we've done something wrong, when my personal philosophy is the pain is the sign that we've actually loved something, right? It only hurts
Yes.
because we love.
Mm-hmm.
And if we avoid the pain, we'll avoid the love, we'll avoid the attachment, and we'll actually miss the assignment that God gave us to connect with one another, to mirror and to bond into one another.
Yeah, pain
So
avoidance is the main way to miss the kind of life God has for us, because being dead doesn't hurt. Being alive is where all the hurting is right now. So it's a sign that you're alive on earth.
and I think moving forward, right?
Yeah.
Dealing with people.
Mhm.
So, most people aren't psychologists or neuroscientists. So what advice would you have for the everyday person to grow in their secure attachment with God, and begin some of that feedback loop of being closer to people, closer to God, closer to people, loving, instead of thinking about loving well?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the thing that I'm glad about is most people aren't psychologists, because psychologists are basically a lot like dentists. They're replaceable. I'm going to be in your life until you get better. Attachments, however, are not. If you try to do functional attachments, it's always going to turn out badly. So if I'm going to try to marry you and turn you into a good husband or wife, I predict a very bad outcome. If I'm going to have relationships with you only as long as you change, it's going to be a bad outcome, because we always feel that conditional love coming our way, and we're going like, I can't settle with this. What if I blow the conditions? And when I see people trying to do spiritual relationships conditionally, like, well, I'll be your spiritual brother or sister or discipler up until you hit the criterion, and then we'll dump you and we'll go get somebody else. These don't produce real maturity either. I mean, it's a good maybe educational step. You learn some facts about God and stuff like that, but you don't form character. So back to your question again, which what are the practical ways? Well, you don't really want to be around people unless you build joy. And joy is actually more regulated by culture than sexuality. So there's more social taboos about who you can smile at and who you can have joy with than there are sexual. And so one of the things we have to do is figure out, how are we going to safely build joy? Joy actually attracts predators. One of the reasons that children get molested, for instance, is they have high levels of joy, and low joy people go looking for them and seize the opportunity to, try to take advantage of that. So it's a very carefully guarded social criterion. When I have families that came in for counseling and I ask them what families are for, I never once had a family say, well, families are for building joy, and joy for the brain are the people that are glad to be with me. So if we say, who are the people that God has put in my life? These are my permanent people. How am I going to build joy with them? So then the second question is, well, how am I going to build joy with you if you're, undesirable, you're nasty, you're somehow else? And now we get to the spiritual life, because I can't build joy to be with sinful, degenerate stuff, hurtful stuff. If I'm going to build joy, it's because I'm going to see in you what God is creating.
Mm,
And the joy is bringing out who God meant you to be instead of who you learned to be. And this is
mm.
the kind of transforming community we have. For instance, Jesus, of his 12 disciples, one of them was a thief. Do you remember which one?
Judas.
Yes, Judas, right. And what did Jesus give him for a job?
He gave him the money holding.
Right, he was a treasurer, because Judas saw in himself a thief, and so did the other disciples, by the way. And Jesus saw in him a treasurer, one who would keep treasures. He could recognize what was valuable. And if only he would take his new identity, um, which Jesus gave him a chance to do, um, he would have been the most remarkable of all disciples, because he would have gone from being a thief to being a treasurer and a treasure keeper. And that's what God does with us. He sees in us, here's what I'm trying to create. Here's what you've done with it. I mean, Moses, was leading his people, but he started killing Egyptians instead. God had to say, that isn't how we're going to lead people to freedom. So there's this ongoing process, in which we build joy with the people God's put in our life. Then we start talking with God about who do you really mean for them to be, and start drawing that out. And that is what sustains that kind of joy. And I always like to suggest to people a very simple exercise, and that is, when you're looking and talking to somebody else who God has put in your life, share your face with Jesus. What's the expression on his face? Practice having the same expression yourself. And because most people don't live in their face at all, they live a couple inches behind their face. They don't connect with their insula. They put a
Right.
fake expression on their face. And so they're thinking, like, how do I share my face with Jesus? I don't even share it with me. And this becomes, it's a fun problem to try to work out. Find two people that'd be willing to work on that with you. And, between the three of you, start sharing your face with Jesus. Um, uh, you know, I even as people do this, uh, look down, think of something you're grateful for, and then how does God respond to that? And when you do that, put that expression on your face and look up at the other people around you, and just keep looking down and up and down and up. These are fun little exercises that I invent out of thin air. You're trying to put brain science to use, but every place I go, people really get fascinated once they get over being nervous.
Oh, in the back of Renovate, you have an exercise that I've done at a large conference of going around and singing "Jesus Loves You" to each other,
Uh-huh.
and the way that it transformed the room was fantastic. And I don't know if they remembered anything we taught them about
Uh-huh.
the topic. It was just an awakening exercise to
Yeah.
create connections so that they could then learn.
Hmm.
And but like I said, I don't know if they remembered anything we talked about. I mean, ideally they did something, but they definitely remembered how it made them feel, and the connection that they had with one another. So yeah, back of Renovate, you've got some fantastic exercises in there. So
I like doing them myself, which is a good sign of it's a good exercise right there. And you can bumble at all these things. That's the wonderful thing about the brain. You can bumble at it and learn while you're going along. No one has to be an expert on it.
right, because then that'll shut down learning. Actually, when we think we're an expert,
Hmm.
like I got this.
Exactly. So
Well, I think the more exercises we have to connect people to their insula and to their social emotion, the more um, I think the healthier we'll be with ourselves and with one another. So, tell us a little bit about what you're working on next.
well, I'm in the process of finishing up a book on enemy mode, which is how the brain starts reacting as soon as I think that you're not on my side. So we don't think of others, we're too nice of a people to have enemies, but actually quite frequently we do feel like someone's not going to be on our side. And the brain then begins to distrust and treat them basically like an enemy, though we wouldn't label them that. And we usually do that mostly with our families. So, you know, as soon as they get on the wrong side of us, or we don't feel they're helping us enough, or whatever it is. So it runs around in families, runs around in churches, runs around in culture. I notice, for instance, if I'm talking to somebody, um, that as soon as I'm waiting for them to just be quiet so I can tell them what I'm thinking, I'm already feeling sort of enemy modish with them. And right now, something like 60 to 70% of people have someone in their family that they're alienated from. They can't talk about certain topics and things like that. So it seems to be spreading like a weed. Uh, and the question is, how do you get yourself out of it? Because the brain will get into enemy mode in a fraction of a second. It's not preventable. We're going to feel someone's not on our side, but then how are we going to restore the relationship when it starts going wrong? And I actually set out to try to rate the answer to that before I knew it. It's like, well, we need to have an answer. But I watched people having fights over COVID masks and going, I don't really know what to do about this. How do I intervene? What, you know, I can see what went wrong, but you know, what's the answer to that? And if that's what Jesus means by loving your enemies and returning blessing for cursing, then it should be the lead characteristic of what Christians do intuitively and well. And I actually found myself being very bad at it. So I had to write a book to see if I could find out, you know, how do we teach people to love their enemies the way the brain learns these things? That's one of the things I like about what you do. You're always trying to say, how do I teach people the way the brain learns? And you know,
I mean,
it
doesn't
sort of
that
puts
sound
a
like
new
it's
light.
easier to
Yeah,
work with the biology than against it? That
yeah.
just seems so hard and impossible.
And it really puts a new light on things we've always known.
Hmm.
It doesn't really change any of the truths in scripture, but it makes some of them pop, you know, when I look at it like, whoa, so that's why that's important. So
Right.
yeah,
Because
that's what I'm working
I
on.
don't think God made us and he was like, oh, that brain is just so hard to work with. I wish I would have done something differently. Like, I think he made us the way he did on purpose. So there must be some good reason for it, right? It must be for us the way that
Well,
he created
the
us.
most
So
far
trying to
out
figure that
part
out.
for me is that, you know, Jesus knew at the time of creation he was going to be having to live in and operate one of those human brains. And if I was going to put myself in, you know, some kind of a narrow, confined space like a human brain, I'd be pretty fussy about how I designed it. So I think it must be a masterpiece. We just don't run it very well.
The other thing I think about, because I totally think about that too, is I think about that Jesus lives in eternity forever now with a human brain.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a fully redeemed version of a human brain without it not being human anymore.
Right.
So I want
That's
that brain.
mind
I
bending.
want to go there.
Mm-hmm. That's, I think, why part of communion is this is my body. The body includes the brain. And I always think of a young Frankenstein movie, you know, where they have the Abby
Love that
normal
movie.
brain. Yeah. And they, you know, they make that one alive. Like, what would happen if my Abby normal brain, the one I run with all the time, was for eternity? Like, no, don't stick me in that mess. You know, that's we want the, you know, his body, his brain. We want, you know, give me one of those.
Right. The mind of Christ actually being the
Absolutely.
holistic thing.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Show me how to do it right.
Oh my gosh. Well, when does your book come out?
It's escaping enemy mode should be out in beginning in November.
Oh my gosh. So soon. So
Yeah.
soon. Well, Jim, thanks so much for being with us today. I really appreciate having you and everything that you're doing and everything that you've done for so like you are the pioneer. We're all standing on your shoulders and walking in your wake since you've been out here doing this for about 20 years. So thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
living that life.
Well, I've thought of it pretty much as gathering the people who want to solve the same problems I do. And so I don't know about gathering, you know, I sort of feel like a scout in front of a wagon train, you know, like well, I'm trying to look for this, but without the wagon train, what's the point in scouting? So thank you for being someone who's really added a great deal to what I hadn't even scouted yet. So
Well,
it's
we're
fun.
all pioneering, right? Just
Yes, you
moving
are.
forward.
Mm-hmm.
So,
All right. Thank you for
all
having
right.
me on the program. I love it.
Thanks, Jim.